Empire and used a lot of ancient tactics, but militarily they relied a lot on chariots, horsemen, so kind of the Assyrian stuff. Then they also had infantry with spears and shields, but they didn't have this specialized infantry. And their naval power, and this is what becomes important. There was two great, I would say, naval civilizations in the ancient world. They were the Greeks and the Phoenicians at this time in history, and they both traveled the Mediterranean trading, and they both built colonies. And in fact, the term colony originates from a Greek word colonia. And so the Greeks colonized a lot of what's now Sicily, southern Italy. They built Massilia, which is in modern day France, Marseille, France, one of the biggest cities in France. They had a city called Saguntum, which comes up in my next video with the Second Punic War. It was all the way in Spain. They colonized one city called Cherno, which is in Crimea, all the way up in Ukraine. So they had and then they had a lot of stuff along the almost all the coastline of Turkey had a lot of Greek city states. Even the northern coastline had cities like Sinople and Nicomedia, and of course you had Byzantium, which was a famous Greek city right there where Turkey and Europe and Asia meet. But all these cities the Greeks were colonizing and building, so they were all spread throughout the Aegean. And they kind of went up even the coastline of the Adriatic into Epirus and further along the Illyria region, which is modern day Albania. So they were spreading all over. The Phoenicians had kind of done this as well. They spread a lot more in Africa, though. They colonized, Corsica, Sardinia, mostly Sardinia. Corsica was originally colonized by the Etruscans and then later taken by Carthage and the Phoenicians. And they colonized North Africa. Their most famous colony, which was a colony of Tyre, one of the cities in Lebanon, was Carthage. And Carthage, I think everybody probably recognizes that name. They were Rome's greatest rival in the early Republic era. We'll get in a lot more about Carthage later on, but for the perspective of where we're at in history, the Phoenicians and Greeks were commercial and naval rivalries. And so when the Persians invaded Greece, they relied a lot on naval power from the Phoenicians, and they built ships in what's now Lebanon and Cyprus. And so that was the Persian Navy, which was massive, and it was mostly piloted, not piloted. What's the ship? The ships were manned by Phoenicians, people from Tyre, Sidon, Ashkelon, all the city states along Lebanon, modern day Lebanon. And while the Greeks, of course, the most famous Greek naval power was Athens, but they weren't the only one. You had Corsica, which was an island in the Adriatic between Greece and Italy. You had Corinth, was a great naval power. You had Crete. Now, there was an ancient Crete civilization called the Minoans that were one time the top naval power, but that's in the Bronze Era. They were gone at this time. And you had a few others, some maybe Argos and stuff, but those were kind of the main ones. Rhodes would be, although Rhodes would later on, that would be more in the Hellenic era. Rhodes would be a famous naval power, Greek naval power. But those were kind of the big dogs at that time. So Persia, the Ionian coastline was constantly involved, and they got material aid and even soldiers intervention from Athens, specifically Halicarnassus, because that was an Athenian colony. Well, the Persian king Darius said enough is enough. He sent a force by sea across the Aegean to attack just Athens and the Attica Peninsula. And famously, the Athenians defeated him in a battle at a place called Marathon. And according to legend, they sent a dispatcher. He ran all the way back to Athens to report on the victory. And when he arrived, he was so exhausted he fell dead. Well, the distance between Marathon and Athens is what a modern marathon is today. So that's kind of where that came from. But Athens did defeat Persia in the first royal encounter. Now, that was only a token force Persia sent. They underestimated the Athenians. They thought, oh, we could just send something over there, send them a message, and they'll leave us alone. Well, Darius passed away, and his son Xerxes came along, and Xerxes was like, okay, I'm gonna go full force. I'm tired of the Greeks. They're too much of a nuisance. So he planned a full all-out invasion. He built bridges across the Sea of Marmara, which that area between the Ardennines, between the Hellas points, what the Greeks called it, between Turkey and Europe. he entered that region of Europe, which is kind of like the little, somewhat owned by Turkey and Bulgaria today. That was called Thrace back then. They conquered Thrace, and they then they entered Greece. They found several allies. They would go around sending dispatches and seeing basically earth and water, and you kind of get, although it's very propaganda, it's more like a comic book style thing, but you kind of get a little bit of that in movie 300 with the dispatch to Sparta. But and Sparta famously did reject this, but they would do earth and water and all this stuff. And it's like, if you submit to the Persian king, we're going to leave you alone. Their primary target was Athens again. They did not like Athens. They wanted to knock Athens off the map. Well, several Greek city states were like, okay, fine, including famously Macedon, who allowed them to go through. Macedon, will get them in a minute. And then, but others rejected them. Most famously, Athens, Corinth, and Sparta, and they formed what's called the Delian League, which was named after an island called Delos, where they all met. And they were all determined to fight the Persians. And of course, you get Thermopylae when the Spartans sent a small force to kind of hold the Persians, and famously 300 Spartans. There was more than 300 Greeks, though. There was about 1,000 other from different other city-states that helped these Spartans, but the Spartans were kind of like the lead force, and they held the Persians at Thermopylae for a significant amount of time. In fact, it was actually a naval battle, then a betrayal on a goat path that caused them to fold. But it bought time, specifically bought time for Athens to evacuate their city to the what's the island's name? Salamis. And then they allowed them to evacuate. And so by the time the Persians got to Athens, there was nobody there. They'd all fled to this island. And so you had the famous Battle of Salamis, which they really decided the war. There was another battle, Plataea, I'll get to in a minute, but the Athenian navy, even though outnumbered and stuff, they had lighter, smaller, faster ships. They knew the water better, and they would get in, ram, and get out, and they wrecked the Persian, i.e. the Phoenician navy at the Battle of Salamis, and it forever changed the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean from then on. Then they, of course, there was the Persian land army was defeated mostly by Spartan led, but it was pretty widely pro-Hellenic group of Greeks, mostly Corinthians, Athenians, and Spartans. And I think there was like Achaeans and Akkadians and different groups. They defeated them at the Battle of Plataea, and that was kind of the end of the Persian War with Greece. And from then on, Persia kind of adopted a strategy of trying to pacify the Ionian coastline, giving them making them semi-autonomous, and then they were all about pitting the Greeks against each other, which happened. So after this war, Athens decided to continue it, but they kind of built a de facto empire. Sparta continued to grow more and more frustrated about it, and other Greek city-states too. The famous Peloponnesian War wasn't just Sparta versus Athens. It was actually all three of the major Greek city-state powers against Athens. It was Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth, which those four city-states, Thebes, which is in the region of Boeotia in Greece, Corinth, Athens, and Sparta were the four strongest of the Greek city-states. Athens had a few allies too, such as Corcio, I mentioned earlier. That island state was an Athenian ally, but there were a lot of them were distant. They were more naval than land powers, and Athens did successfully fight the Persians some during the interim period, even taking Cyprus and even invading Egypt and helping an Egyptian rebellion. So they caused a lot of havoc for the Persians, and they really continued to break apart the Phoenician naval dominance. That was another key factor. So Phoenicia continued to decline. Well, Sparta eventually destroyed Athens in the Peloponnesian War. I'm not going to get into the details. That's a whole video itself. Then Sparta was taken out by Thebes, and both Athens and Sparta never recovered from this. So people talk about the Spartans and Athenians, and of course I got my Spartan shirt on right now. I couldn't find a Roman shirt, so I went with the Spartan shirt. But they would be around during the rise of Rome, and I'll get to that in the second video. But they were never powerhouses after this. Athens recovered a little bit and territorially recovered a lot of what it had, but slowly power shifted to another rising state in the Greek world, and that was Macedon. Specifically, one king to put it all together, King Philip III. He was the father of Alexander the Great, and Philip made some noteworthy. Actually, I need to step back a little and talk about Hellenic tactics, because Hellenic military tactics, and specifically the Macedonian. When I get to Macedonian, I want to talk about the regular Greek tactic, then get into Macedonian, because that would be the dominant military formation the Roman Republic went against. It was the dominant military tactic of the Hellenic world, the Roman world, the rest of the world around Rome. And the Greeks relied on what's called an infantry unit called the hoplite. And the hoplite was very effective against the Persians. And the hoplite strategy, you had a round shield and a spear, and usually had some armor and the helmet. They would band together in a formation called a phalanx, and they would march at you. And the whole goal of the hoplite was to pin you, especially Macedon. When I get to how Macedon adjusted it, but they would come at you, and what happened? The Persians had nothing to counter that. They would, if you run at them, you're going to get impaled, because it's like a wall of spears marching at you. It's like a porcupine marching at you, and they had flutes. They were very well trained. They used like light skirmisher infantry on their flanks to protect them, and sometimes they would rout in horsemen. Macedonians would use horsemen a lot. I'll get to that in a minute. Their shock cavalry was very famous, but so the Greeks, whenever they went up against Persian infantry, Persian could not break the phalanx formation. They had nothing to do it. Even the immortals couldn't do it, and that's why the Greeks continually at Marathon, even though it was a defeat at Thermopylae, was a narrow defeat at Plataea. The Persians had no counter for the Greek military tactic, and in fact, the late Persian Empire was notorious for hiring Greek mercenaries. Famous Greek leader Xenophon, who wrote a whole diary about Persia and its empire and tactics that Alexander the Great studied and read extensively. He was famous for having hired to fight in a Persian civil war and having to get his men back to Greece, march through half the Persian Empire, fighting, because he was on the side that ended up losing the civil war. He ended up fighting Persian army after Persian army to get back, and he wrote everything he knew about the Persians on there. And in fact, we know a lot about Persian culture from Xenophon. But so the Persians had no counter. Well, the Macedonians upped it even more. So Philip invented this new tactic where they used to use 10-foot long spears. Philip increased it to 12 and 14 feet. They put a weight at the end of it. It gave them a smaller shield called a sarissa. And so the Macedonian phalanx they had longer spears, so they could outdo the Greek phalanx because of that, the hoplites. And they called them pikemen. They distinguished it from the phalanx, the hoplite troops, and they called theirs the pikemen. And that's, I guess, where the first word pike comes from. The Macedonians also used a very heavily armored skirmisher unit on the flank called the Hydralitis, and they would use shields, swords, and throw javelins and stuff. So they would cover the flank with them, and then they had skirmisher infantry, slingers, which are like what you think of David and Goliath, archers, bow and arrow, and peltis, which were like they threw spears. And so they would cover the flanks of the Macedonian regiment. Macedon and one of the early kingdoms that conquered Thessaly. Thessaly is also very famous. Had very famous horsemen. A lot of Greece was very mountainous, and you couldn't raise a lot of horses, so they were used a lot. But the Macedonians had flatter land, and so did Thessaly. So they would equip what's called agema cavalry, especially Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great would be even better than Philip. Philip improvised the infantry. Alexander the Great, in fact, Alexander won the pivot battle at, I think, Carnea against Athens and Thebes. Athens had allied against Macedon, and their army was crushed at this battle. And Alexander the Great, even though Philip was the commander, Alexander the Great's cavalry charge actually turned the tide of the battle. And so the famous agema shock cavalry. And so how the Macedonian tactics work, and they did this over and over again. Alexander the Great did this to Persia constantly. The core infantry, the phalanx, goal was to pin the opposing infantry. Then the horsemen would ride around and flank them, hit them in the back, or hit their command structure. Alexander always went for, I think it's Darius. He went for Darius and always went for the command structure. And as soon as the Persian army saw Darius fleeing, they turned and fled. This happened at Gaugamela, and this happened at Ipsus, the two of the most famous battles where he fought Darius. And but that was the Greek military, the Hellenic military tactic, and that the pikemen phalanx formation will be the base of almost all the major Greek empires, or and even Carthage and others that Rome would go up against. Even early Roman Republic used phalanx and hoplite tactics. Now they adjusted it to match some of the Celtic style warfare, and I'll get into the Celts because they fought differently, and the fact they started using square shields that were longer, and they used swords. They had swordsmen. All their troops had swordsmen, and the Greek hoplites had swords too. They had a small blade. I can't. What was the name of the blade? But they would pull that out, and they could fight if they needed to go hand to hand. But their formation was very, it was very difficult to move the phalanx on the battlefield, and that would be a weakness compared to the Roman legion, which was very flexible to move around the battlefield. And I'll get to that in video too with the Macedonian Wars. So basically, Macedon emerges. They defeat, as I just said, they defeated Athens and Thebes, two of the great powers of their time, in the Theban Sacred Band, which was at the time the dominant military unit in the Greek world, because Sparta was in decline. Famously, that Macedon never did enter Sparta, and Philip sent them a threat about something like, if you don't sign this treaty, I'm going to cross through the Hellespont and crush you guys. And they smack a letter. It supposedly said if, just to mock him. But Sparta was not part of the, I'm trying to remember the Council of, is it Council of Delphi? No, League of Corinth. League of Corinth, that's it. So League of Corinth was basically Macedon banding all of Greece together. And its purpose was Philip was planning an invasion of Persia. Now, I think his invasion was less ambitious than what Alexander would do. But Philip famously was assassinated. There's some people who think Alexander may have been behind it. There's some people who think his mother was behind it, because there's a whole sordid affair. You can get it. I need a video about Alexander the Great, about Olympia, the wife of Philip, he was on the verge of separating from her. I think they were maybe divorced, and he had remarried, and there was thoughts that he would usurp Alexander the Great with another son he was going to have. And Olympia and Philip hated each other for all intents and purposes. But Olympia was a very big fan of her son Alexander and thought very highly of him. She always thought he was like the chosen one, which kind of filled his head and made him confident. She braggingly said that Philip wasn't his father, that Zeus was. So that all this stuff filled. Already, he's being told he's a son of a god. He got educated by Aristotle, and a lot of his famous generals were educated with him. He called them the companions, and so there's a lot of young men that he spends time with that later became his generals and colleagues, and even they built their own kingdoms like Ptolemy. They were all educated with him. Well, Alexander the Great, and I'm not gonna get too quick into him. He took over for Philip, smashed the Greeks really quickly, defeated Greece's rivals Thrace and Illyria to hold his flank, invaded the Persian Empire. Within a few short years, took the entire Persian Empire out. He then went on to India and Bactria and all this stuff, and took all the east. And at the age of 32, he dies in Babylon after he campaigned a lot in India, and he on the way back, his men finally started mutiny. He never lost a battle. Never lost a battle. The only reason he retreated was because his men got tired and wanted to go home. Because they're just like, okay, we've done everything we need to do. It's been going on and on, Alexander. And Alexander wanted to keep going. He wanted to go to the ends of the world. And no telling where he would want to go if he had kept it going. But he ended up going back to Babylon. They suppose that he either got sick on the way back or got poisoned. We never know. He dies at the age of 32 with no clear heir. And here we go. He got an empire that stretches from Greece all the way to India, includes all the great ancient kingdoms, Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq, Egypt, Iran, modern, Persia, the Mede Kingdom, Bactria, which is what's now Afghanistan, a lot of that Turkmenistan, Central Asia area. I mean, all of what's now Turkey and Armenia and that area. It was a massive kingdom, bigger than even the Persians. And at that time, because of the Greek colonial era as well, it was said you could travel from Spain all the way to India speaking only Greek, because they would Hellenize the world. Hellenic culture would take on a fire like none other, because they would build cities throughout his empire. Alexandria's like Alexandria, Egypt. You would have Greek colonies there. They would raise their own troops there. They would teach people there, and then all the people that weren't Greek, and this came back to haunt some of the empires, both help and haunt. They would try to have them worship the Greek gods, learn to speak Greek, learn. They would build the what's the oh, oh, Odeons, these famous Greek. They were kind of like these. You'd carve them into the side of a hill and be like basically areas where people can come sit, like theaters. And they could do both dramatic events, they could do political meetings. They used it for like all purposes, kind of like a community center. They build these in all their cities. They would build markets. So they were very aggressive at expanding their culture, and their people would go out from Macedon and colonize all of Alexander's empire. So much so that it weakened Macedon itself later on and caused some havoc. So many of them went and colonized cities like Seleucia, which is basically close to what's now Baghdad, and was started on the precursor for what would become Baghdad. And then you had Alexandria, Egypt, which still exists today. You had one of the Alexanders, I think, is Esqueret in Afghanistan, which is modern Herat in Afghanistan. A lot of cities still exist today, and so because this Greek culture just spread across the globe far faster than Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, or any of the powers before them. So the world that Rome entered was a Greek-dominated world. The Macedonian military formations dominated military tactics. Now, the challenge with the Greeks after Alexander died is they never could be united. They broke apart over what's called the Diadochi Wars, Wars of Diadochi. And I kind of got in a little bit of that in the Hanukkah video, but basically, when the dust settled after these 4 wars, there was a lot of his generals were involved in it. You had really 3 major states and some smaller states, but the 3 major ones was one based in Europe, just called Macedon. It was the Antigonid dynasty, which is known as Antigonus. They ruled it, and you had one in Asia, which spread from modern day Turkey all the way. At one time, it controlled a lot of India. They did give that back to an Indian empire called the Mauryans. But it controlled like Bactria, which is Afghanistan. It controlled Parthia, which would come into play later. It controlled Persia, the Medes, all that, and they were called the Seleucid Empire. Then you had the Ptolemies, Emperor Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most famous generals, and he ruled. He primarily focused on Egypt, but he also controlled what's now Israel, Lebanon, Cyprus. He controlled, I think, for a little while, Crete. There were some cities along southern Turkey they controlled, and some parts of mainland Greece. So these empires were kind of massive, and no Greek city-state like Sparta or Athens could stand up to Macedon anymore. It was just there was too much people, too much resources. They had superior tactics, and all that stuff. So how the smaller Greek city-states tried to keep their independence and fight against him, and there were several wars. The Lamian War was the most famous one early on, the War of the Diadochi, but sometimes they would win, sometimes they wouldn't. They'd go back and forth between being dominated by Macedon, primarily Macedon, who tried to dominate Greece, and other times getting independence. And later on, Rome would totally play on this. When I get to the Macedonian Wars, you'll see how Rome pits the Greeks against each other and uses that to take control. But divide and conquer, famously. And so you had the city-states would kind of band together, so a lot of these smaller Greek cities. And there were 2 powerful leagues that did that, the Achaean League and the Aetolian League. And they were the 2 powers that resisted Macedon. I'll get to them when Rome enters Greece, because they play a big part, and they're part of that story. So Rome enters the Greek world. Now, there is another major group of people that are spreading across Europe, and they're called the Celts. Just like the Greeks, they're not united. They settle in what's now modern France, called Gaul. They settle in Hispania, what Rome calls Hispania, which is modern-day Spain and Portugal. They settled in Britain, which is modern-day England. They settled in areas what Rome called Pannonia, which is modern-day Hungary, and Dacia, which is modern-day Romania. So they're all settled in all these parts of Europe. Famously, one group, a mass band of Celts entered, and this is when Macedon really got in trouble, because they had already been depopulated due to all these wars and people going overseas and colonizing. There was a group of Celts called the Galatians, later called the Galatians. They entered what is now Macedon, and they actually overthrew and took the Macedonian capital. And there was nobody really there to stop them, because Macedon was in the middle of a civil war, all this stuff. And that's when the Antagonists came back and took control and finally ran them off. They eventually end up what is one now Turkey. So there's a region in Turkey that you see in the Bible. Most famous because you have the Galatians in the book of the Bible, but is Rome central Turkey. They were defeated by one of the Seleucid kings, and they were settled in Turkey. They used Celtic tactics, which relied on swords and shields and charging people. And they would be hired, because they're such different militarily, they'd be hired by these Greek kingdoms fighting each other. And they would later actually be conquered and pacified by Rome. But they were notorious for raiding all those areas around Turkey. And Turkey was never quite as prosperous once they came in, because they were a constant threat. Well, at least until Rome comes along. So the Greek Empire, basically all these three, especially specifically these three big ones, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and the Macedonians, they start a slow decline by the time Rome's coming into the picture. Now they would have, someone would see, actually about the time Rome fought them, they would have good, strong leaders. They would see kind of a resurgence, all except the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies would just slowly start a slow decline. They'd kind of be, Ptolemies would be kind of the wealthiest of them, and they would be the last one to be overthrown, but they would start a slow decline. I'll get to them more when I get into the later series of Rome, but that's kind of the world that Rome's in. You got the Hellenic world, and then you got this Celtic world that's being built up. And the Celts impacted Rome dramatically. They would, most famously in the year. So that was kind of a good stopping point last time. I didn't really say I got interrupted, but so we kind of finished off starting to get into the Celts, and Celtic kind of strategy would involve usually just charging the enemy in mass. That was basically their tactic. Use with swords, axes, whatever they had on them. They didn't rely a lot on. They had horsemen, not as much on them, so it was basically just like a chaotic feel. And of course, I told you the story of the Galatians, but you had another big incident. Have it dated here. Yeah, Celtic warrior, probably from Cisalpine Gaul, which was the area of northern Italy that was full of Gallic people that Romans mostly fought in the Republic era. Now, by the time of the late Republic era, that whole area had been conquered, and they were going into the real, what we call Gaul, modern France, especially on Julius Caesar. But one of their warlords called Brennus, in the year 387, this was after Rome had just defeated the Etruscans and had started to secure northern Italy. He charged into Italy and sacked Rome famously, and it was something that was never forgotten. The Gauls, the Celtic Gallic people, were always kind of the Romans' head from a psychological warfare because of what happened there. Kind of like the outside threat, and you kind of get it really didn't evaporate till after Caesar had conquered them, and that kind of how Julius Caesar, which won't be until the end of the video, got kind of a name for himself. But so they were kind of another one of the Rome's enemies. And then of course we have Carthage, who, as I explained earlier, was a Phoenician colony that slowly started growing and getting stronger than all the other colonies around it that were Phoenician, and they would kind of incorporate them into an informal empire, the Carthaginian Empire, and they slowly expanded to control pretty much all of what was now Tunisia, the coastline around Algeria. They had territories going into what's now Spain, and then they controlled the islands Sicily and Sardinia, and then even later on Corsica. So they would be eventually an opponent Rome would fight. Like Rome, they had a kind of a council. They were like a republic called the Niet, which voted on major issues, and they would elect a leader and sometimes a general and stuff to lead them. So just like Rome, they kind of had a democratic government. They were notorious for exploration. There was, we know they had expeditions that went all the way to, I believe, circumnavigated Africa. So they went all the way down the coastline of Africa, famously. And there's some theories that they may have even found the New World, but they were pretty well-known traders and explorers. The Carthaginians, another thing notorious, which Rome used as propaganda, was they did engage in human sacrifice of children to their gods. They believed in, like, Baal was a famous god, Molech. So some of the ones that we equate to demons, they followed the Canaanite gods that Israel, if you follow the Bible, were brought up constantly by God and stuff in the Bible not to follow. So they did follow the old Canaanite gods. And Rome used some of the religious practices as propaganda warfare. We can get into the Punic Wars, and I'll get more into Carthage as we get into that. But that was kind of one of the other players in that part of the world. So you had very different cultures and strategies Rome would encounter, even in the Eastern strategy, which the Greeks somewhat, specifically the Seleucids, somewhat copied, where they would bring in, for example, they brought in elephants to use in battle, and they were pretty effective against horsemen. They brought in the scythe chariots, which they saw the Persians used against them. They're called irregular warfare units. They bring in cavalry, which again were effective against horses because horses naturally hate the smell of camels. And mostly the eastern strategy, when you get into the far eastern part of the world, and even the northern area, what we would now call Ukraine and Russia, you had one tribe called the Scythians, who, while they were a major player, they relied a lot on horseman tactics, where they would hit and run with horse archers. They would shoot at you, then run away, shoot at you, run away. It really wore you down in an attrition kind of warfare. And this is why the Roman Empire never, even at its height, never effectively controlled like Iran in the east again, because it was too much of a logistical challenge and nightmare. So this is kind of the world that Rome kind of went into, and I'm gonna try to maybe here I may try to post a map of Italy pre-Rome. Rome was a group of people called the Latins, and kind of the background of them. If you get into the founding of Rome, they were originally a kingdom with a king, and they're part of a people called the Latins, which were mostly around the central part of Italy. There were other groups who were called the Umbrians, who were kind of over here in the northeastern part. You had the Samnites, who kind of followed the mountain ranges in the middle, going north to south. The Etruscans, who were to the northwest. In Umbrians northeast and Etruscans northwest. And the Etruscans were pretty advanced in their time from a commerce and city building aspect. The very southern coastline of Italy had a lot of Greek city-states: Croton, Tarentum. What's the other big one in that area that I think it's Bari today, but they call it a different name. Croton, Tarentum, Rhegium. That was what they called it. Well, no, Rhegium was the one at the boot. There was another one over there. They had several city-states. Tarentum was probably the most powerful of them. That would eventually draw Rome into a war that I definitely won't get into the second video, with a Greek Epirate king named Pyrrhus, which kind of saw Rome's first war outside of Italy, or at least a faction that's outside Italy. It started beginning when Rome started get noticed outside of Italy. But I'll probably remember that city-state in a minute. It's over here in that little. It's real close to modern-day Bari. But so the southern kind of part of Italy was all Greek city-states, and so Rome slowly it took the Latins first, but they were a kingdom originally. And it's kind of an interesting story. There was a king called Tarquinius, and he was one of the Roman kings, and he apparently was not a very good king, spoiled brat, and he took a daughter of one of the nobles named Lucretia, and he raped her, and they call this the rape of Lucretia. Well, the nobles did not like that, and this girl was so distraught over it, she ended up killing herself, according to legend. And so 4 of the prominent nobles, Lucius Junius Brutus, keep that in mind, Brutus, Lucius Tarquinius Colentius, Publius Valerius Pacacola, and Seppus Lucretius Straseptinus. Mouthful of names. The 4 of them gathered basically all their resources and launched a war and overthrew Tarquinius and drove him from the city of Rome. And they made Rome a republic, where it was with a senate that voted on the rules. And that's supposedly the Roman Republic came along. And it actually faced several wars against Tarquinius. He kept coming back with the Latins and the Etruscans, enemies of Rome, and tried to take the city. And Rome defeated them both times. But Rome would slowly expand and take Italy. And interestingly, they had an interesting way with Italians. In the early Roman Republic, only Romans were originally citizens if you grew up in the city of Rome and surrounding area. Then they kind of made it where Latins were considered Roman citizens. But all the Italian people were called allies. And Rome basically would take them and then make them into allies, where they de facto kind of controlled them. They took taxes and they did other stuff. But the main thing these allies would do, they were expected to provide men in a case of war. And Rome would actually reward them by paying the city-states. They would promise these soldiers booty and stuff like that, plunder, when they took over lands. And so Rome was able to build all these Italian armies around them, which formed their core of their legions in many of these wars. So the city states they had kind of autonomy on laws and stuff that they could rule, but they would form around these allies, and so they would kind of really support them in these upcoming wars, notably the Punic Wars and stuff as they went along. So it would slowly incorporate all the Italians. They also slowly adopted a new military system, and it kind of blended Gaelic and Greek ideology. And the early Republican legions were not like the Imperial legions that you see on TV, and they're kind of like iconic. They had three castes. They had Hastati, which was the front line. Usually they were lower, less equipped, more like militia they would bring in. They did carry two pilums and a sword gladius sword and a roundest kind of shield that almost made. They didn't have the square shield yet. You had the Principes, which were the middle line. They were a little bit more armored. They were veterans. They were trained. So they were kind of like I'd say kind of like what would be regular military in the U.S. So militia would be kind of like more like that. The Hastati more like National Guard or general militia, while the Principes would be like your standard military. And then you get the Traorii, which were the back line, and they came in and filled gaps when things got really bad. And they were actually primarily focused around spears, while the Principes had swords. And they were basically the command elite shock troops to win in the fight. And so they were kind of, you had the three wrong legions. And then they had a unit called the Velites, which were also kind of veterans, and they were the auxiliary, kind of what the Hypatites were for the Macedonians. They were kind of like, they guarded the flank, but they were a little bit more mobile. They could actually use swords and stuff, and they were notorious for being able to both attack from a skirmisher perspective, but also engage with a front line. Rome also, interestingly, implemented spies, and then they had horsemen that they used a lot in their divisions. They called them equites, which is another name for a knight, and they were the nobles. Actually, usually the higher class Romans were horsemen, and so they could kind of blend, as you're seeing here. They got spearmen, but the one interesting, unique thing that they did that nobody did prior to them is these swordmen shield kind of units that could pin people because they have these shields as well, but the pilums, and it was very psychologically damaging for every opponent they'd go up to because they would march up to you and fire a volley of these spears at you. They basically throw them, and then they would pull out the swords and come at you with the shields. And the Romans were famous for, like, they would engage and they would actually rotate men. So you'd have one man behind the other, and they would flip back and forth to kind of keep one from the exhaustion. And they would try to pin you with the shield. It's really brutal. And they would try to hit you with the sword in your belly, which wouldn't kill you. It would actually demobilize you. So kind of a brutal kind of form here. They would throw spears at you to shock you. And a lot of Roman tactics involved about scaring the opponent off the battlefield. Intimidation. And so we're getting that, but they slowly, over the course of by 270 BC, they had almost full control of Italy. They conquered the Samnites, the Etruscans, the Umbrians, and there was another group, the Sabines, as well as the Latins. Latins were the first ones they took over, which was like and Latins were totally incorporated full Roman by the early Republic era, while the Italians, which we'll get this in the late Republican era, weren't considered full Republicans. And definitely, you wouldn't get to the Imperial era. People like to live in Hispania or Greece, and they were not Roman citizens. Later on, they could later in the empire buy it, but eventually there would be, I think, in the 3rd century or 2nd century, I can't remember, an emperor that would declare everybody in the Roman Empire citizens. That's another story for another time. We won't get to that stage, but and that's kind of important to distinguish with this whole alliance system they had with the Italian city-states that gave them autonomy as long as they helped Rome in war, paid a little bit financing. It wasn't a major tax and all this stuff. So, in the Second Punic War, this would be very important because Hannibal would try to win the other cities around Rome to rebel, like Capua and Neapolis and stuff. So you'll get kind of into that, but they it allowed an interesting system where they can conscript massive armies and manpower. And Rome was notorious for being able to overwhelm with manpower in the early era. Macedon, Carthage, all of them. They have a unique military structure that you don't see in the ancient world that kind of blends the Gaelic kind of fighting with the Hellenic kind of fighting. and their units are very versatile. Their ability to engage in diplomacy, engage in military. They have at this time, they were a very disciplined society, not anything like the decadent Rome that we image. We hear about the Roman. They were very family oriented, very loyal to the religion, very loyal to their state. They had a famous leader that actually fought Brennus in the Gauls called Cincinnatus, who I think Cincinnati might be named after in Ohio. But he famously, and George Washington mimicked him, when he went and won the battle and he had full control and all the people and everything was loyal, he could have become the king or the dictator. And he went back to his farm and went back to the plow. He gave up his public life and went back after the height of his influence, height of his popularity, height of his power, kind of like a George Washington kind of setup when George Washington surrendered over the Continental Army. So Rome at this time was a very, especially compared to other nations in the ancient world, a very stable, very for a non-Christian name, very pagan, not pagan, very disciplined society. And you would constantly hear writings, even in the late Republic and the Empire era, about trying to get back to this moral, disciplined golden age of Rome. And it's a common, reoccurring thing, especially when we get in the late Republic. You'll see we've lost our values, we've lost what made us great. But it'll really get them through the Punic Wars of Carthage. You will see where, especially the Second Punic War, where Rome, disaster after disaster was faced by Rome, and they were relentless and not giving up. When most of these nations I described in this video would have collapsed, Rome plugged forward, and because at that time their society was built on something stronger. And ironically, had Rome had that in the era where they fell, they would easily have defeated the Huns, the Goths, all those people that end up destroying their empire. But yeah, very different society than what they would become later on. So some of this series will kind of get into how the Roman Republic rises up, becomes the power, and then how that almost kind of corrupts them and leads to their slow decline, specifically the end of the Republic itself, which we'll get into. But definitely, hope you guys have enjoyed this early podcast. More focused on the world around Rome. I did briefly touch into how they took over Italy. I'm not going to get in details. Like, there's like 3 wars against the Samnites. There's like 2 wars against the Etruscans. There was kind of back and forth, and one of the, I think, Samnite wars, they defeated both. I think the third ones when they really defeated both the Samnites and the Etruscans both, and took both. They kind of fought a war north and south and won in both fronts. But they had slowly taken over Italy. I'm gonna pause. The only areas they have not taken over right now is southern Italy, which is our Greek city-states, which they're slowly encroaching on. Northern Italy is still controlled by the Gauls, but they've got fortifications. And then Sicily is still outside Rome's influence, but that's to come as well, as it will cause another major conflict for Rome. But they're still mostly on the Italian boot. They're getting some attention now. They're going to get some attention. There's going to be the first fight's going to be with the Greeks, and I'll get into that, the Pyrrhic Wars, and then we'll get into the Punic Wars, and then Rome expanding outside of Italy drastically over the next century and a half. And I hope the second video I plan to start with the Pyrrhic War, then go through the wars against Carthage, and then Macedon. Now Rome took over Greece, and ended at 146 BC, which is kind of like the high water mark of the Republic. And then you start getting into, even though after there's a massive territorial expansion, you start seeing the decadence and the civil wars and all that stuff after 146, where things start to go against the Roman Republic. But kind of a long series, a lot to this, a lot I did not cover, but hope you enjoy it. And I keep getting interrupted. I think you heard maybe them call my wife and daughter calling for dinner, so I'll probably run down for that. But yeah, thank you everybody for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this series. So hey everyone, kind of a follow up on this. I was going to show you kind of where some of the places and the maps and the people are looking at a world view. So if you kind of zoom out, and this kind of really shows the world of Rome, and I kind of makeshift put this together. So we talked about Assyria. It was really in this area of the world, northern Iraq and Syria. And then you had Babylonia down here, Media and Persia right here. And of course Bactria, Cappadocia, and you're going over here into India eventually. Of course Egypt's down here. But the Seleucid Empire controlled a lot of this area, while Egypt controlled maybe up into here through this area. And let me see if I can get like but hopefully you can see my pointer. And you had Carthage was over here and was now Tunisia. I mentioned in my podcast Thrace, Dacia, Scythia, Pannonia, Gaul, Hispania, Cisalpine Gaul, which is like northern Italy, Illyria, which is really that area that eventually, if you look in the 1980s, the map of Yugoslavia, basically that's Illyria in the Roman world. Dacia would basically be Romania. Thrace is mostly Bulgaria, but includes all this area as well that's part of Turkey today. And this is the Hellespont. I think I called it Ardennes. It should have been Dardanelles, or I mispronounced that at some point in the podcast. I mispronounced several things. I had should have been Chaeronea was the battle that Macedon defeated. It's somewhere in this area, but defeated Athens and Thebes, because Thebes is right here, this little area called Poetica. There's Attica where Athens is. Corinth, and I misspelled this. It was the Isthmus of Corinth, not the Hellespont. That's up here. But Corinth was very valuable because it blocked access into what is called the Peloponnesian Peninsula. The Achaea, which comes in later, is in this little part of Greece, up in this northwest corner of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Sparta is down here at the bottom, and then there would be this area over here that's just north of the Peloponnesian Peninsula that faces Italy. That would be where Aetolia or the Aetolian League emerged, and there's the Oracle of Delphi is in that area, and another Greek city-state called Thermon. And of course, if you go further up that coastline and get where you're near Italy, that's where Albania is today. That's Epirus. So I might get into more detail with Greece in a future when they come relevant in a future podcast. But mostly want to focus here on Italy. And I kind of use some colors because I couldn't get the words in very well. But you could see Rome and the Latins were effectively right here in the middle of Italy. Probably one of the more prosperous areas. It's basically where the city of Rome is today. You had just south of it Neapolis and Capua. Neapolis would eventually become Naples in Italy. And they were settled by Latins and Italian people as well, but they kind of were under control at times by the Greeks and kind of worked together the Samnites. Samnites are kind of brown. They were really more in the mountains, but they were one of Rome's most effective enemies in the early Italian wars, and Rome learned a lot from them and used some of their tactics. The Umbrians were up here in the northwest corner. They were not as hard for the Romans to conquer. This little green slab was supposed to be the Sabines. They were kind of between the Umbrians and Romans. They were another threat. They were partly because of how close they are to Rome, and they were kind of in the mountains and you come down, and they dealt with them that way. Then you have the Etruscans up here in yellow, and the Etruscans were kind of like I wouldn't say that they were militarily strongest. I feel like the Samnites were a worse threat to Rome, but they were the more advanced Italian civilization, and they had very good diplomacy and statesmanship and stuff that they could use to rally other Italians against Rome. So Etruscans and Samnites were the two that Rome really battled a lot until they get to where the southern Italy area, which is purple, which is the Greek part. And the city that I kept thinking of, I said Bari, I think it may be modern Bari today, but it's called Brundism. That was the one I was looking for, the term. But Brundism, and I'm liable to mispronounce this, but it was right here in this part of Italy. You had Taranto was up here in this part, kind of where this like toe of the boot, right when it connects to the shoe part. It's really just a little bit to the left of it. Then you had Croton, which is down here going down in the toe, and you had Rhegium, which is at the very bottom facing Sicily. And Sicily will become a major player in the next podcast against the Punic War that is to come. So I kind of played around with the map. Of course, you see Macedon is right here. Greece is right below Macedon, all those areas. And of course, you got the island of Crete and Cyprus. This kind of gives you a view of the Roman world on a map. And of course, all the north area, barbarian area, which barbarian is a Greek word making fun of the Celtic or Germanic people or Scythians, or they made fun of their language, called a barbar. Like, they're not civilized like us, they're barbarians. So of course, this is Ionia, this coastline of Turkey that faces Greece on the Aegean. And you had Lydia, which was a kingdom that's more internal. It was kind of a little bit, later on they called it Phrygia, but that was kind of a little bit further into Turkey, but still close to that area facing Greece. And this is basically the Greek world. Hopefully this clears up some stuff from my podcast. Oh, I can't believe I didn't have any interruptions this time. But yeah, as I go into it, I may play a little more with this map, give you an idea of what is going on and different stuff. I also thought about doing a video just on the Roman Senate and government, because I know these videos are going to be running long, and because that's very unique, and it wasn't tied to my original outline I did for doing the series. So I think I may just do like a special video, possibly right after this, going into how the government and the system works. That's kind of important to know, especially as we get in a third video where there's a lot of challenges and breakdown in the government. And I don't try to be too political on my channel, but I want to kind of tie it probably in an apolitical way to things that are going on in the United States today and how our own government system might be breaking down like theirs. And there's some similarities. It's like almost the prosperity of Rome weakened Roman culture, and I sometimes wonder if the prosperity and everything America has is weakened American culture. So there's kind of connections there. Did kind of same thing with the Greeks as well in a lot of ways, and they're kind of in a declining. They're considered decadent and declining at this time in history. And there's a famous Greek writer Polybius that I might get into that, where he explains why Rome succeeded and um, Greece did not. But basically, Rome is now. You see this red line up here. They basically control everything between the red line, all this stuff at this point where I stopped the video. Maybe not the purple. They're starting to cringe a lot into the purple, though. These are kind of, let's say, vassal states at this point. And there's going to be a kingdom over here, Kingdom of Epirus, and a famous military general, Pyrrhus, where the term Pyrrhic victory comes from. And I'll get into that. But he's going to come in, and he's going to be the first real outside challenger to Rome. And, of course, it will play into the part that shortly after that, you would get into the First Punic War, which was the most destructive war in ancient history, and it's basically fought over the island of Sicily. That's kind of where we're going here. Hopefully, you guys are enjoying my series, and I love doing other history series. I really like to get into not just a lot of it's the military and the political changes and stuff, but I also want to get into how the average person lived. I feel like that plays a big part in how we got here today, because all these people invented stuff, they grew, they developed, and our society today is kind of built on the back of everything, all these ancient civilizations, medieval civilizations, early modern, everything that they built. We've prospered off of that. We've learned, we've built, we've grown on what they built for us. So we owe a lot to all these. We see these names on a map, and you think like, oh, Egypt, and Egypt invented a lot of stuff we use today, or the Romans or the Greeks or the Carthaginians. They all contributed to how we exist in our very world today. So it's very interesting to learn that. So these aren't just names on a map. These were people that lived, died like we did, married like we did, went through challenges like we did. So it's something I always consider as you go through this series, that these are real humans who went through real experiences. It's something I always it's kind of humbling when you think about that. But hopefully everybody enjoys this series. Did some quick follow-ups to kind of try to replace some of my mispronunciation and mistakes and stuff I couldn't quite remember when I was doing the video, and then kind of giving a context of where all these places are on the map, as you can see. And so there you go. Alexander went all the way out here. Rome won't do that, but they will. All these lands in white are going to eventually start becoming red over time. You'll see as this continues on. But yeah, thank you everyone for listening to the podcast, and feel free to like and subscribe moving forward. Thank you.